Yes, my name is Lisa Rupple, and I work for the Ohio Historic Preservation Office. I'm the Survey and National Register Manager there. And I'll go into a little bit about what the office does. We are basically the state agency that coordinates all federally funded preservation activities. So if you've heard of the National Register of Historic Places, if you haven't, that's okay. But we manage that program for the state of Ohio. There's also the federal tax credit program, which can go towards rehabilitating historic structures that are listed to the National Register. That's also another program that's administered through our office. And we also do preservation planning and some other preservation-related activities throughout the state. So just to give you a little idea of where we're coming from there. And it's part of the Ohio Historical Society. So basically, I'll go over just real quick because we're a little shorter on time than in the last session, but I have a PowerPoint presentation that I'm going to run through that will cover sort of what historic documents are and how you can research them to learn more about architecture and your community. And then I'll go into a little more about Nelsonville and its architecture. And then we'll take a respite outside in the lovely hot weather out there to do sort of a little exercise that will hopefully bring the things I've talked about sort of into the real world application for it. So basically, when you're looking to research a historic property, you have to ask yourself a couple of questions, and I'll go over. I have examples of primary and secondary resources that I'll try and run through for you guys. And then using those resources plus looking at buildings, how you can estimate its age, how you can understand how community has developed and grown and maybe has died off a little bit. So from its settlement to its peak to its post-peak period. And then what can that architecture tell you sort of about that, about the history of this area. So primary resources generally are sources that are created within the time period. If it's for a building, usually it's when the building was constructed, so like a deed or a tax record or some other source that was created specifically or during the time that you're studying. So it could be not just 1 year, but it could encompass a number of years. It could encompass, say, for Nelsonville when the coal industry was still active, so it could encompass that whole time. If there are company records, say, from the coal companies, you can look at those. Those could be considered primary resources. And secondary resources are publications that are derived from primary resources. So they can be a book about a particular architect or a recent publication about the history of a community. So a few things like that. And we'll go through some of these examples. So the documents that we'll go over here are available. They're public record, so you can go into a library, you can go into county offices, you can go to archives, and they're open usually during business hours. You just have to sort of know where to look and what you're looking for. And this, I would think, we could consider a secondary resource. First type of resource, this is a primary resource. They're deeds, deeds of transfer and abstracts of title. These you'll find in a county recorder's office. They're usually located in deed books, so you have to, basically you can start from one end or the other. If you know who owns the property now, you can trace the history of a property back, owner by owner, by using deeds. And this is a really useful resource because you can get the name and the time, the name of the owner of the property and the time in which they own that property. So you can really put together sort of a backbone of the history of your property. And the names that you are able to capture here, you can use later on for other resources, which I'll talk about. Tax information is really helpful to help you understand sort of the evolution of a property. And by property, I mean land and building. So you can have a piece of property before there's ever a building on it and say you want to know when a house was built. Then you can look at these tax records and you can see if the value of a property jumped from 1 year to the next, say it doubled. So up here it talks about in 1840 a house valued at $500 was pretty substantial at that time. Well, say in 1839 the property was valued at just $500, but by 1840 it's valued at $1,000. So that kind of gives you a good idea that maybe something happened on this property that has doubled its value. Probably that house was built. It's also useful because it is another source where you can see names of owners. And it also can help you identify if there's been additions or alterations to the property. So it's basically any improvements that have been done, you can kind of track through using tax receipts and tax duplicates. And one other thing I want to point out is that these older records, before they use typewriters, can be challenging to look at because the handwriting is not always legible. So it can take a little bit of skill, but you develop that, you kind of figure out. Especially on deeds, they sort of say the same thing over and over again, so it can make it a little easier. But keep that in mind. Sometimes printing is neat, sometimes it's not. Here's some examples, some more tax examples. This is a tax map for the city of Hamilton in Ohio, and this dates to 1846, this map does. So it's fairly early on in the community. And here you'll be able to see what the lots looked like, and you can compare that to how your community looks today, to give you an idea of how property boundaries may have changed. Something else that deeds and tax records are good for is understanding how the property, the size of the property may have changed. So the deed records will always have a description of the property, and it'll go into a pretty detailed description. So if you have a 200-acre farm, say, and all that's left of that farm is 2 acres with a historic farmhouse sitting on it. Well, how did it get to that point? Gosh, there was 200 acres and now there's just 2. So by going through your deeds and looking at your tax maps, and I'll get into plat maps in a minute, you can see how the property may have shrunk over time. And that tells you, too, about how communities change over time. So a community that was fairly rural is now pretty urban, or suburban, in that matter. So these are really helpful for that. And this is a tax card which is specific to the property. So for each property there'll be a tax card over the years. So every time tax has been reassessed, you'll see an update on the tax card. This particular tax card has a footprint of the building. It shows some outbuildings, which is really helpful because this garage may not be there today. So there you have an idea of, aha, there was some more to this property than there might be now. And the footprint of the building, if there's been an addition or an alteration or something's been removed, that'll give you a clue if this doesn't match the property, how the property looks today. All right. State and city directories. Directories are very useful, especially with information you've gotten already from your deed research. Directories are, the older directories are listed by name, so you can go through if you know the name of the person you're looking for. Directories will often list profession. They'll list the address where the person is living, or where the business is. And this can really help you flesh out the history of your property, because you're learning more about the people who owned it beyond just their name and how long they lived at the property. And also that are in these directories are advertisements, which are can be absolutely wonderful sources of information, especially if you're looking, you're researching, say, a contractor or a builder or an architect. They'll put ads in these directories, and here they've put examples of their work. So if you're really lucky, there'll be a picture of the house maybe that you're looking at, or the store you're looking. If you're researching a store, there might be an ad for the types of goods that they sell in the store or the services that they offer. So these can be really valuable sources of information. This is an example of some information you can find in newspapers regarding architecture and community history. Oftentimes when important buildings opened up in a community like this opera house or other civic structures, they'll cover it in the paper. And you can get some interesting information from them, because they might cover who the architect was, or they might talk about some interesting details that were inside the building. This is actually an artist rendering of a residence in Cincinnati. And if you were, it can be a little painstaking because I don't think there's any quick way to research this. So it might take some time, but if you find something like this, this is a really useful piece of information, because here's a period rendering of your property, and it may or may not resemble what this looks like today. So you can really see where the changes might be.